It all began, old Amy said, with a meteorite. Before that time the only legends of note concerned the witch trials of centuries past. There was a small island in the Miskatonic River, where the devil is said to have held court before an enormous altar of stone, older than the Indians. Then at noon one day the meteor fell, trailing a white cloud, with a string of explosions overhead, culminating in a pillar of smoke, which rose from a valley deep inside the wood. By nightfall all of Arkham had heard of the great rock that fell from the sky, bedding itself in the ground beside the well at the Nahum Gardner place. Of course that was the very house which had stood where the blasted heath now lay. A white house with black trim. The house abutted Nahum Gardner's fertile orchards of apples and pears. Nahum came to town to tell people about the extraterrestrial rock, dropping in on his way at the cottage of Emmy Pierce. Emmy was then 30 years young, and all the puzzling details were permanently etched in his mind. Emmy and his wife arrived slightly ahead of 3 professors from Miskatonic University, who hastened out within a couple of days to see the unnatural fugitive from unknown space. Mrs. Pierce wondered aloud why Nahum had called it larger than the height of an average man. It seemed to her no taller than the height of a young teenager. It must have shrunk, Nahum said, pointing out the size of the scar it left in his orchard, a wide brown trough between twin lanes of charred grass, ending with the alien artifact in a hollow of the earth, within spitting distance of the well. However, the men with doctorates informed the rustics that stone does not shrink. A bit of its heat lingered still, and Nahum declared that at night it fairly glowed. One of the professors drew a rock hammer from his back pocket, which he employed to attack the artifact. He found it oddly soft like tar soap. Rather than chipping off a specimen, the learned man gouged a strip of the substance from its surface, which curled off like an orange peel. He bore the sample in an old pail borrowed from Nahum's kitchen. On the return trip, it was Mrs. Pierce who noticed that the fragment was growing smaller and burning the bottom of the pail. The very next day brought the reappearance of the 3 wise men, now in a state of great excitement. When the specimen was heated on charcoal, there was no off-gassing, and there was no temperature at which it could be forced to evaporate. It proved extremely malleable upon an anvil. It was tested in a crucible against all manner of reagent. Submersion in water produced no reaction, and neither did submersion in hydrochloric acid. Against the invulnerable surface of the sample, nitric acid and even aqua regia merely hissed and spattered. Against a dozen other testing agents, including ammonia and caustic soda, alcohol and ether, as well as sulfuric acid, left no mark behind upon its surface. It was a kind of metal, though. The sample was magnetic. Upon heating it before a spectroscope, emanated bright bands of light, unlike any colors of the normal spectrum. There was talk of the discovery of a new element. At the end of their work, they gathered in a glass beaker the chips into which the original fragment had been divided for testing. But even this did not prevent the specimen from fading completely away. The place on the wooden shelf where the empty beaker sat was charred by burning. All this the professors told Emmy as they loitered at his door. Once more he accompanied them to visit the stone messenger from the stars. Once more it was found to have shrunk. Even the sober professors had to admit. Surrounding the dwindling brown lump near the well was a larger portion of the pit which it had vacated. Whereas it had been a good 5 feet across the day before, it was now scarcely 3 feet in breadth. The educators detached another larger piece, with hammer and chisel, and as they pried away the mass, they discovered the core of the meteorite was not quite homogeneous. They had uncovered a colored globe, which might have fit in the palm of one's hand, embedded in the interior. The color, which resembled those bands of strange spectrum, was impossible to describe. It was only by analogy that they called it a color at all. The texture of the globule was hard and shiny, and upon tapping it, it sounded hollow. One professor gave it a smart blow with the hammer. The surface proved rather brittle, and it burst with a pop into 1,000,000 tiny shards. Nothing was emitted from the broken bubble, but it left behind a hollow spherical void about 3 inches across. After a futile attempt to find by chiseling additional orbs, the seekers left again with their new specimen. The new specimen proved, however, as baffling as its predecessor had been. It presented no identifying features of any element found on Earth. At the end of testing, the scientists of the college were forced to admit they could not name it. It was not of this world, but a piece of deep space, and as such was endowed with unnatural properties, and obedient to unnatural laws. That night there was a thunderstorm. The stone, because it was magnetic, must have drawn the lightning. 6 times within the hour, the farmer Nahum Gardner saw the lightning strike the hollow in his front yard, and when the storm was over, nothing remained but an empty pit by the ancient well. The scientists verified the meteorite had vanished. Nothing was left to do but go back to the lab and test again the last dwindling fragment, now stored in a case of lead. The final sample lasted a week. When it was gone, it left no residue behind. In time the wise men found it preferable to forget the encounter, lest it prove their lack of scientific skill. The newspapers of Arkham recorded the incident, sending reporters to talk with Nahum Gardner and his family. One Boston daily also sent a scribe, and Nahum quickly became a local celebrity. He was a lean, genial person of about 50 years of age. He lived on his pleasant farmstead with wife and 3 sons. He and Amy exchanged visits frequently, as did their wives, and Amy had nothing but praise for him after all these years. Nahum was proud of the notoriety which the meteorite had attracted, and he retold the story many times in succeeding weeks. But the following months of July and August were not to be wasted. Nahum worked hard at harvesting hay from his 10-acre pasture across Chapman's Brook. His rattling hay wagon wore deep ruts in the earth. The labor itself seemed more fatiguing to him than it had in earlier years. He felt his age was beginning to tell. Then came the time to harvest his fruit. Nahum swore that his orchards of apples and pears were prospering as never before. The fruit was growing with phenomenal girth and a prize-winning gloss, and in such abundance that extra barrels were ordered to handle the crop. But when the fruit was tasted, his disappointment was keen, for of all that gorgeous array of luscious fruit, not a single one was fit to eat. Into their fine flavor a stealthy bitterness had crept. Even the smallest of bites left a sickening aftertaste. It was the same with the melons and tomatoes, and Nahum soon realized that in the area of his homestead, his entire crop was lost. He would say that the meteorite had poisoned his soil. He thanked heaven for his other crops, in an upland lot along the old road. Winter came early, and it was very cold. Emmy saw Nahum less often than usual, and Nahum always looked worried. The rest of his family, too, seemed to have grown taciturn. They lapsed in their attendance at church, and other various social events of the countryside. All the household confessed to poor health and a feeling of melancholy. Nahum said he was disturbed about certain footprints in the snow. He recognized them as the winter prints of red squirrels, white rabbits, and foxes. But the brooding farmer discerned that something was not quite right about the nature and arrangement of these animal tracks. It was not characteristic of the normal anatomy and habit of squirrels or rabbits or foxes. Emmy put no stock in these stories until one night, on the way back from Clark's Corners, when in his sleigh he drove past the Gardner homestead. In the light of the moon, a rabbit crossed the road in front of him, and the leap of that rabbit was too long and too high. Emmy's horse took it even worse, needing firm rein to prevent it from running away. Thereafter, Emmy was more respectful of Nahum's tales, like how the Gardner dogs were cowed and quivering every morning. Nahum claimed they had lost the spirit to bark.